We're going to start working our way through the book of Daniel. We've been looking at some of the Old Testament prophets just in one sitting, but Daniel had such a long career and so much to offer that I want us to go a little more slowly through the book of Daniel. He was one of those unfortunate folks that lived right in the time frame when Babylon had reached its peak of power and was beginning to conquer that whole Near East. And as a result, he was in a place where God could use him, and God uses him in a very special way, but he's probably 13 to 15 years old when they start taking away captives into Babylon. So he doesn't get to grow up and live his life in Jerusalem as he might have wanted to do, but he becomes very useful to God in a foreign land. And most of the book of Daniel deals with his relationships with foreign dignitaries. He has a good reputation. He is somebody that they turn to for advice from time to time. And when they listen to him, they do well. And when they don't listen to him, not so well. But let's look at the beginning of Daniel, chapter 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia. How many of your translation says Chaldea or Nobody? Everybody's got Babylonia? I think people have kind of settled on that now. Some of the older translations will have or Chaldeans. Who was from of the Chaldeans? Abraham. Right? This is back his old stomping grounds before God brought him up. And put them in the treasure house of his God. That puts us in about the year 605 BC. And this is the first time that Nebuchadnezzar came and laid siege to Jerusalem. He's going to do it 2 more times until eventually the place is destroyed in 587. But over the next few years, there's going to be kind of a constant paying of tribute to Nebuchadnezzar. He'll take the king from Jerusalem and put him in prison in Babylon, keep him there for a while. Lots of different political intrigues are going on. And he's showing his power by making the Israelite kings his vassals. So they're paying him all kinds of money to not come wipe them out. Eventually they rebel enough that he does just that. But Daniel's going to be in the first wave of captives. So he's going to be in Babylonia for several years before Jerusalem is actually destroyed and the temple torn down. Probably around 18 to 20 years that he's going to be living over there. Did you notice the phrase that they took some of the articles from the temple of God? This has been a long-standing question. Whatever happened to that ark? Did they hide the Ark of the Covenant prior to the Babylonian invasion? Or did the Babylonians take it? Did they hide the Ark of the Covenant prior to the Romans coming in 70? Or did the Romans take it? Nobody really knows whatever happened to the Ark of the Covenant, but there are lots of different theories about where it was, where it may be, whether it got melted down at some point or whatever happened to it. And it makes for a good movie, right? Raiders of the Lost Ark, pretty good movie. Look at verse 3. The king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Chaldeans, or of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. So we find out some things about Daniel, and we find out a little bit about Chaldean culture in this part. Daniel was a blue blood. He was royalty of some kind. He was either part of the nobility or part of the royal family itself. That was one of the qualifications for who Ashpenaz was supposed to choose. So when he goes and looks at these young men, and these guys are probably in their mid-teens, they're very young men, he's supposed to evaluate their ability to learn, which means, how intelligent are they and how willing are they to make compromise, to learn new things. Can you teach them new tricks, or are they just going to hang on to what they already know? They needed to be young, smart, and good looking. So without flaw, strong, able to do what they're going to want them to do over the long haul. So Daniel is one of those. And Daniel shows even more aptitude than the others with which he is brought to Chaldea. He's the cream of the crop. He's one of the best of the choices that Ashpenaz makes. Why did Ashpenaz pick Daniel? Right? He's got this list of qualifications. Why does he pick Daniel? Because God wanted Daniel picked. Right? This is important stuff. This is not happenstance. Daniel didn't accidentally end up in Babylon. God put Daniel in Babylon for a purpose. And it tells us a little bit about the Chaldean culture. They were very proud people. They were proud of their heritage. They liked to have things done their way. So they're going to bring these Jewish boys over and teach them how to be good Babylonians. They don't want to bring them over and just find out what they know. They're not going to stick them into jobs and say, hey, teach us about your culture and teach us about, what you learned growing up. No, we're going to put you into a training, and you're going to be in training for 3 years before we give you any responsibility. So it's a re-education camp for 3 years. We're going to get rid of the Jewishness of you, and we're going to insert the Babylonian way of doing things. They're willing to spend a lot of time and a lot of money, I guess, in training these guys. They want them to be exactly what they want them to be when they get them out. We don't do it much anymore, but in the earlier days of the country, young men would sign on to learn at the feet of a master craftsman, right? And they would spend so many years learning the trade and so many years working off their indebtedness to the master craftsman before they could ever hang up a shingle of their own. Well, for the Chaldeans, it was 3 years. You need to learn our ways and learn what you need to know and learn our language. So they had to, I don't know how similar the ancient Chaldean language is to modern Farsi or, the languages that are spoken in that area. This would be Iraq, basically, where they were all living. The same is true, by the way, of the Medo-Persians. When the Medo-Persians came in and defeated the Babylonians for about 75, 80 years from there, they were equally as proud of their culture, and they retrained the Chaldeans to do things their way. You remember when King Xerxes was looking for a bride, his bride wouldn't dance or wouldn't be entertainment at a party, so he kicked her out and he says, bring me all of the virgins from the land, and he interviewed them. It took several months before you got to the interview because you had to learn what a Medo-Persian king thought was beautiful and what he considered to be attractive, what he considered to be sexually motivating. You had to learn all that stuff before you could ever go in and meet the king. So these cultures would re-educate each other to make sure you were one of them and not just somebody that was living there. Verse 6, among those who were chosen were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. How many of you know those three names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah? Right? Who are they? We know who they are. That's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We keep their new names, and we keep Daniel's old name. You notice that? I guess because the book is named Daniel, we're told that he's called Belshazzar, but we don't call him that. You know, it's not the prophecy of Belteshazzar, it's the prophecy of Daniel. So we keep Daniel's old name, but we go with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego for the other three guys. And they're evidently about the same age, all of them from nobility. Perhaps they knew one another, ran around together when they were still living in Jerusalem. Once they get kidnapped and taken over to Iraq, over to Babylon, they're still together. They're a group. And they know one another, and evidently they trust each other, and they trust Daniel, which becomes very important as we go through the rest of the book. Verse 8, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Notice it's 2 times we've used the word defile. Right? We'll talk about that in a minute. God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this, and he tested them for 10 days. So Daniel's cutting deals as to whether or not they'll be just like everybody else. The royal food is the thing in question, and we're not sure exactly. That phrase is only used twice in the Old Testament, what's translated royal food here. And we don't know whether that food was special in some way other than it was the best. Right? So they're wanting to feed these kids really top-notch food. I don't know too many of us that would trade in whatever this was for vegetables and water. I'm not a vegetable and water kind of guy myself, but there was something about it that Daniel found objectionable. In fact, Daniel said, I don't want to defile myself with these foods. So looked to find a few guesses as to why he thought that these things would be defiling. I don't think that we should take this passage to mean we should all become vegetarians. I don't think that had much to do with it. But it might have had something to do with unclean foods, that maybe they ate things that Jews were not allowed to eat. One commentator said that they ate horses and camels, and that Jews would not be allowed to eat the meat from those animals. But we don't know. We're not given a menu, just that Daniel found it to be defiling. Another commentator said maybe they had offered it to idols. If they were offering these meals, if they were offering the meat to Marduk before they brought it in to fix it for the kids, maybe Daniel knew that and he didn't want to take part of that. But whatever it was what the king was eating at his table. So it was considered to be the best food you could eat to get as strong as they wanted you to get. It was their way of doing things. It was their regimen for getting you to be like them. And Daniel turns it down as something that's going to be defiling. Look at 2 Kings 25. There's one more possibility. Let's see. I've got 25:27, is that right? Yeah. The very end of 2 Kings. In the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the year Awel Marduk became king of Babylon. He released Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison. He did this on the 27th day of the 12th month. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiakim put aside his prison clothes and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day, the king gave Jehoiakim a regular allowance as long as he lived. So he paid him, and he got to eat at the king's table. If you're Daniel and you have just been kidnapped and brought from Jerusalem to Babylon. Is that treasonous? So that was another thought. One of the commentators said, well, maybe he just didn't want to be in cahoots with the Babylonians. If the Babylonians think that we need to eat these meats, whatever they are, and the king is eating it at his table, then I don't want any part of it. So it would defile me to be in league with these guys. So you could pick any of the above or none of the above as why he thought it was defiling. But the bottom line is, when he says we want to eat just vegetables and water, his keeper is concerned that he's going to wither away and not be as stout, not be as good looking as the rest. And that was his fear. But he cuts the deal with Daniel. So look at verse 15. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier, better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. So he was on standby with the other stuff. After 10 days, they were expecting for Daniel and his friends to look poorly, and they did not. And so he let them continue during their 3 years of training to eat what they had been eating all along. Did you notice that it was not just sweet food, sweet meats, whatever the dainties were that the king was eating? They also turned down the wine. Now, there's nothing scripturally that I can find for that, but it may be that the two things went together. And it may point us more to the idea that it was from the king's table. Right? We don't want to be taking things from the king's table. So even though there's nothing really wrong with the food itself, nothing really wrong with the wine itself, but it would defile us to be in cahoots with the king. I honestly do not know what the right answer is there. Verse 17, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. So when they're going through their 3 years of training, the Chaldeans are teaching them what they think is important for their time in service to the Babylonians. What God is doing is giving them gifts that are going to be important to his cause while they're working among the Babylonians. It's a big point throughout the prophecy of Daniel that he's learning to work for the enemy, but he's gifted and dedicated to God. That's an ongoing theme that we'll revisit several times during Daniel's life. He doesn't just do it when he's young and 15 and bulletproof. When he gets older, he lives to be, I think, somewhere in his young 80s, maybe close to 84, 85. And all that time, he's working in state matters. He's the go-to guy. So he's been in the government of the Babylonians from the time Nebuchadnezzar kind of sets up his kingdom all the way through. So he knows Babylonian politics inside and out. And he's a very useful guy. But the subplot is, what is God doing through Daniel while he's living among the Babylonians? And those are the things we remember about Daniel. Those are the things we remember about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they're in the middle of the enemy camp, but they're still very faithful to God. They're not going to give up their relationship with God. Or, secondarily perhaps, their relationship to being Jews, right? They gave them new names. Well, they changed how they were identified, but they couldn't change who they were. Verse 18, at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. You remember when Moses went to Egypt to bring the people out? The magicians could do some of the tricks. And then as things went farther along, they went to Pharaoh and said, you need to let this guy, you need to listen to him. We can't do this stuff. We've got no tricks in our arsenal that can keep up with what he's doing. It was basically when the gnats came. They couldn't make gnats and they couldn't get rid of gnats. And they were ready to just throw in the towel at that point and say, why don't you listen to what Moses is saying? He's out of our league. So all the time that Daniel is with them, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're 10 times better than everybody else. They're not just a little better. They're so far ahead of the pack that you have to notice them. And if you're Nebuchadnezzar, you have to keep your eye on them and realize that these are not Babylonian kids. These are Jewish kids. And so there are interactions with him and with some of his, some of the guys that follow after him as king. Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus, which was around 538 BC. And history tells us that he was about 84 years old when he died. So long life, really strong relationship with God, very useful in his work in Babylonia. One other thing, I want to look at a passage in Ezekiel here real quick. If you want to go to Ezekiel 14. While you're going over there, let me remind you of one other thing. When they got off of the ark and the men settled in to Shinar, and they on the plains of Shinar, and they were going to build this amazing ziggurat, this amazing tower to reach up into the heavens. We're going to make a name for ourselves. And God comes down and makes them lose their ability to communicate with each other. He changes their languages. The place where they did that also is in Iraq. So Babylon, Shinar, all of these places, several Old Testament places, are in that area of Iraq. So when you talk about, in the New Testament, when you mention Babylon, it's not just the Babylon that took them captive. That's the biggest part of it. But there's also that underlying problem of other things that happened in that area that were contrary to what God was trying to get done. Okay, Ezekiel 14, and look at verse 12. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, if a country sins against me by being unfaithful, and I stretch out my hand against it to cut off its food supply and send famine upon it and kill its people and their animals, even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they could save only themselves by their righteousness. That's what the sovereign Lord says. So even in Ezekiel's day, and Ezekiel and Daniel were contemporaries. They lived about the same time. Ezekiel thought that much of Daniel. All right, so the word of the Lord comes to Ezekiel and goes, man, if we could get Job and we could get Daniel, and who's the other one? Noah. If we could get Job, Daniel, and Noah together, there wouldn't be enough righteousness to save the rest of them. They could just save themselves. That's how set he was on destroying some of these nations in the time of Ezekiel.